Alistair Scott.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I too rise in support of this bill. Mr Speaker, this bill, I'll refer to the two trusts as the Old Trust and the New Trust, but this bill, the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Board Bill 2015, refers to the obligations of the Old Trust, being the Associated Churches of Christchurch Extension and Property Trust Board, and what I refer to as the New Trust being the Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board. Mr Speaker, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Honourable Dr Nick Smith in bringing this bill to the House, but also to acknowledge the church that we're referring to make the initiative to be forward-thinking, to think about the future for their people that they serve in their communities. Mr Speaker, this bill is really an evolution. It's been referred to already, an update, a change in the legislation or in the rules governing the trust to adapt to the times that we're in. Mr Speaker, the reason this bill has been brought to the attention of the House is because of the restriction that the existing Act places on the board trustees. There is some concern that the Act requires them to focus and reinvest in bricks and mortar. And we know, sir, that the churches of today are much more than that. We know that the churches of today are much more than bricks and mortar. They are there to serve the community. They do things like, for instance, the Salvation Army spends and invests money and time and effort on their State of the Nation analysis, which was recently released. Churches invest in food banks. They might subsidise a driver who helps people in their community. And churches have always done this, sir, and they will continue to do this. And they're particularly important in rural New Zealand, where some, for example, bus services, public transport may not exist because of the population base. So these churches have a very important role in our rural communities. And so when a church is restricted or feels that they're restricted to invest in bricks and mortar, there's a problem. We also have a problem when there are bequests made to the church. The bequestor, is that the right term? The bequestor intends the money to be used for the purposes of the church rather than for the purposes of the Act, which talks about bricks and mortar. So the bequestor is quite keen to see more food banks, more petrol subsidies to drivers, and so on. But in fact, and this is the dilemma that the trustees would have, they have the intentions of the bequestor, but then they're restricted by the Act. So this bill, sir, it transfers the obligations of the Old Trust to the New Trust. The obligations, as far as contractual obligations, commitments, liabilities and assets, are exactly the same. So when one contract refers to the Old Trust, it will automatically refer to the New Trust. So that is a nice clean transition. Mr Speaker, I find it's, in fact, the next bill which will be brought to the House also is in similar vein in that it's an evolution of legislation in the same way. Mr Speaker, I'd like to pick up a point which I concur with made by Mr Henare regarding the Māori church schools and commend again the Christian churches of New Zealand for being forward-thinking. And I think we have to continue to evolve and rethink about where we are in the community and what our real purpose is. And I commend Mr Henare for challenging Māori church schools to rethink their purpose with the assets that they have available to them, in much the same way as the Christian churches of New Zealand have done today. Mr Speaker, I'd just like to point out a slightly what I think at least is quite interesting irony in the discussion that we've had today, in that all the members of the House have spoken in support of enabling the board's trustees to have greater flexibility in the management of their assets so that they can focus on the things that matter. The things that matter, of course, are the people. And we've all talked about that, the importance of enabling the trust to do what they wish with their assets, with their buildings, with their bricks and mortar, to perhaps sell as the church shrinks, or even if the church is growing, to perhaps sell a property for the benefit of supporting community services, to focus on the people. And Mr. Speaker, my point here is that is what this government is doing in the social housing sphere. And it's ironic, I find, that the opposing benches support this bill, but they don't support the freeing up of the social housing sector vis-a-vis focusing on the people and the needs of the people, sir. So I find that interesting, and I think this bill is quite an interesting parallel to what we're doing, what the Christian churches have done with their assets, and what this national government is doing with the government's assets in the social housing sector. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very tidy and evolutionary piece of legislation that is going to enable the new trust to focus on the people. It is going to enable the new trust to not be concerned about breaching the Act if they were to invest in something other than houses and bricks and mortar. And, Mr. Speaker, I commend the Christian churches of New Zealand for the initiative that they've shown in bringing this to the attention of Honourable Nick Smith, so that we can progress this through the House, so that they can do and continue to do the good work in the community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. Those of that opinion will say aye. Aye. To the contrary, no. The ayes have it.
Christian Churches New Zealand Property Trust Board Empowering Bill, second reading.
This bill is set down for committee stage next sitting day. I call on private and local order of the day number 2.